This is the 7th session of the Book of the Covenant with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of Rabbi Silber's ongoing analysis covering the first 2 books of Tanakh, providing a central analysis of the laws of Exodus chapters 21 to 23, central to the covenant of Sinai. For today's sources will be coming from chapters 23 of Exodus and 22 of Deuteronomy. If you have a preferred Tanakh or Bible, you are welcome to keep it at hand, but sources will also be shared on screen. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, so we are started to add 3 more sessions to the previous set of sessions, and today is the second of those sessions. I just wanted to, we're not going to obviously delve into all of the various laws that are found in what we call Parshat Mishpatim, but did want to touch on some of them at least, and perhaps to try to get some perhaps a broader picture about what this is all about. Many of these laws are actually laws related to civil law. There's capital offenses, and then there's also a lot about civil law. For example, in chapter 23, the first many verses, I would say up to the first 9 verses, or 8 or 9 verses, refer to civil law, to judgments, to rules of law. And actually, it's a very interesting question. I'll just put out there now. Maybe next week we'll pick this up. But to whom is the Torah speaking? In other words, when you look at the beginning of chapter 23, for example, it's not really clear to whom the Torah speaks. Is the Torah speaking to the courtroom, as it were? Let's start with the judges, with the witnesses. Is that what this is talking about? That's certainly a possibility. And is the Torah also addressing the individual person, not necessarily in the context of a court case? And the truth of the matter is that question about whom the Torah addresses in much of this chapter really goes back to the very first pasuk that we saw, the very first verse in chapter 21, which is V'ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. These are the judgments or the laws you shall place lifneihem, before them. And the question is, who is the them? Is the them the judges? These are the rules that the judges, these are the laws, these are the principles that the judges will use when they adjudicate all these different kinds of cases. That's one possibility. Or, Ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem, these are the rules you shall place before them, is not referring to the judges. It's referring to the people in general. And the truth of the matter is, that question sort of takes us back to the story in Parshat Yitro in chapter 18 that we had looked at. Remember that story in chapter 18 where Moshe is sitting by himself. Yitro, his father, has come to visit him, and he sees Moshe sitting all by himself with a long line of people in front of him. And he says to Moshe, what is this? Why are you sitting by yourself? And Moshe's response is, the people come to seek judgment. People have disputes. They have a judgment, they have a question of law, a dispute with their neighbor. They come to me, and I'm the one who can adjudicate. I'm the judge who can tell them what the ruling should be. And Yitro said to him, that's a very bad idea. Lo tova davar she'ato oseh. We all remember this. You can't do it by yourself, says Yitro. It's not possible. One person can't be the judge for the entire nation. Let me give you a piece of advice, and choose from amongst the people. And Yitro gives certain qualifications: people of integrity, honesty, etc., people who are courageous, and they will assist you in judging. And Yitro maps out this whole plan he has, how to include many people in assisting Moshe in Moshe's judgment of the people. And Moshe adopts what Yitro says. Yitro had told him that there are certain matters that are too difficult for the people, those matters they will bring to you, and you will bring them to God, and God will give you the appropriate response. But other matters, let the people judge by themselves. Now, the point of that story is more than one point to it. And one of the points is that what Yitro has done in effect is to hand over judgments, to take them away from one person, from one judge, and to make it a much more democratic institution. That is to say, Yitro has the full involvement of the people. Not every person can be a judge, but the point of it is hand over judgment and justice to the people. That's one of the things that Yitro is doing over there. The second thing he's doing is he's saying to Moshe, Moshe's argument there, we remember, is that nobody really has the right to judge anybody else. Justice and judgment come only from God. And Moshe said to Yitro, look, I'm the only person who has access to God. And therefore they come to me. No one else has access. And Yitro's response is, you're right, in principle. But in practice, it doesn't work. And therefore we have to find a way, we have to have a system which can work. Because if it can't work, there's no justice altogether. And therefore, so the matters that only you can resolve, you can bring them to God. And all other matters, the people will in fact be participants. Interesting, in that context, we spoke, if you recall, about the fact that at least according to the rabbinic understanding of Pashat Mishpatim, I'm not convinced it's the Pshat, but the rabbinic understanding, which is found in many places, is that the word Elohim in Mishpatim refers to judges, not necessarily to God. V'nikrav Baal Habayit El Elohim is understood rabbinically, at least. You bring the matter to the court. The court may impose an oath. But the fact of the matter is, it's not that the matter is brought to God in the sense of some kind of oracle, that you go to someone who has access to God. That's the rabbinic understanding. In terms of what the pshat is, I have my doubts about that, which I've expressed in the past. I do think it means in Pshuto Shamikra, you take it to God, or some kind of oracle, or Urim V'Tumim, or whatever it is. But in any event, that's not the rabbinic understanding. And the rabbinic understanding is based on this idea that on one hand, God is the only true judge. On the other hand, people come to Moshe for judgment. So yes, God is present in the court. God gives the court a kind of acceptance, kind of justification. But effectively, God doesn't make the actual decisions. It's a whole other question. In any event, I raise that now because it really speaks to the question of Ela mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. These are the matters you shall put before them. And the question over there was, who is the them? And I'm raising I think it's a related question, which is in many of these verses, it's very hard to know whether it refers to the court or whether it refers to the person. For example, let's look at chapter 23. And some of this I hope to continue with next week. So I want to focus this morning on the different verses in chapter 23, which we'll get to soon. But let's take, for example, in chapter 23, verse number 2. Lo tiyeh acharei rabim l'ra'ot. Do not side with rabim. I would say the many. Don't go after the majority. Don't go after the many l'ra'ot to do harm or to do evil. Now, to whom is that referring? Don't follow the majority in a matter of doing evil. So a rabbinic interpretation, which Rashi quotes on this verse, by the way, and Rashi himself, it's unusual, long Rashi. And Rashi says he has problems in the pshat of the Chumash with the rabbinic understanding. It's a difficult verse, and maybe we'll deal with this next week, but do not follow the majority to do evil. That could refer to a regular person, to anybody. It says you're making a decision. and you take a poll, and 60% of the people believe X, and you think that that's wrong, it's immoral, it's not right. Says the Torah, don't go with that view just because it's the majority. If in fact you know, to the best of your knowledge, that it's not right, you don't necessarily have to. You shouldn't, not necessarily. You shouldn't follow the majority. It's referring to an individual person. In fact, the story that there's a story in the Bible. I just thought of it now, which actually comes to mind in respect to this verse. Lo tiyeh acharei rabim l'ra'ot. A very, very interesting story. And I just thought of it now, and I think we should turn our attention to it. Let me see if I can find it quickly, where it is. It's in the book of the Mulachim, actually. Now that I mention this, let me see if I can find this. May take me a minute. Yes, it's in chapter 22 of Mulachim Aleph, First Kings, chapter 22, and I will tell you the story, the background of the story, and we'll find the particular verses. And this story reminds me of this verse that we have in our parsha, in our study, Lo tiyeh acharei rabim l'ra'ot. Story is the following. In the book of Kings, we all remember, the country, the nation is divided into two parts. There's the southern kingdom and there's the northern kingdom. After Shlomo dies, the kingdom is divided. Most of the country is with the northern kingdom, which is called in the later prophets Ephraim or Yosef or Yisrael. And the southern kingdom is called Judah, Yehuda. That's the remnant of King David's kingship. So one of the main characters in the book of Kings, he's a king of the northern kingdom, is actually named Achav. And he's the king of the northern kingdom. In chapter 22, the king of the southern kingdom at that time is called Yehoshaphat, who was presented overall as a in the book of Kings anyway, as a fairly decent person. So Yehoshaphat comes to visit the king of Israel, Achav, and Achav says to him, Achav says the following, the beginning of chapter 22, he says, our neighbors to the north, the Arameans, are causing all kinds of trouble. And they're claiming that Ramot Gilad belongs to them. And would you help me, he says, will you help me fight against Aram? Will you join me in the war against our common enemy? So Yehoshaphat says to Achav in verse number 4, Kamoni kamocha, kiami kiamecha, kisusai kisusecha. So Yehoshaphat says, listen, I'm with you. My troops are your troops, my horses are your horses, etc. I'm good to go with you. Even though Achav is generally speaking spoken of in very negative terms, but Yehoshaphat says, listen, we have a common enemy. So then Yehoshaphat adds, Vayom Yehoshaphat Melech Yisrael Roshna Kayom et Devar Hashem. So Yehoshaphat says, I'm willing to go to battle, but before we go to battle, let's inquire of God. Let's see what God has to say about this endeavor, about us going together. Let's. So it says the king of Israel, verse number 6, gathers 400 prophets. 400 prophets. And he says to them in the 6th verse of chapter 22, should I go fight to capture Ramot Gilad, or should I stop? And they all say, Alei, go up, and God will hand them over to you. You will be successful in the war. Fine. So we have 400 prophets, and they all say the same thing. Alei, Yitain Hashem biyad hamelech. So Yehoshaphat that's the king of Judah, he says, "Ain po navi Hashem od v'nidrasha me'oto." He says, "You got your 400 prophets. Maybe the prophets of Baal, but don't we have a navi Hashem? Can we find one navi who speaks in God's name, Hashem's name? Let's ask him. I see all these 400 prophets, but they don't see Nevi'im Hashem. Can we get one Navi Hashem? I want the opinion of Navi Hashem." Vayom Melech Yisrael Yehoshaphat, O Ish Echad V'Droshet Hashem Me'oto. There is one prophet of God who speaks in God's name, who would seek out God's voice. V'anis Neitiv, but I hate him. Ki lo yidnabei olai tov ki imra. He has nothing good to say about me, so I don't like this guy. Michael ben Yimla. His name is Michael, the son of Yimla. Vayom Yehoshaphat, Al Yomar HaMelech Cain. And Yehoshaphat says to Achab, "Don't say that. Don't say that." So fine. So Yehoshaphat wants him to summon Michael ben Yimla. Let's get his opinion. We have 400 prophets all saying, "Go up, you will win." Vayikra Melech Yisrael el Saris Echad. Vayomer Mahara Michael ben Yimla. So the king says, "Okay." He speaks to one of his officers and he says, "Hurry up, bring me Michael, the son of Yimla." Umelech Yisrael v'Yoshaphat Melech Yehuda Yoshvim Ish al Kiso. Mlubashim begodim begoren petach shar shomron. B'chol haneviyim mit nabiyim lefnehem. You have this picture. The two kings are sitting in the threshing place in the Goren, and in front of them you have all these prophets. There's some details of this I can't get into. So it's one of my favorite stories, actually, but leave out some of the details. Vayaslok Tzidkiyahu ben Kenana karnei barzel. Tzidkiyahu, the son of Kenana, made for himself iron horns, and he said, "With these you shall defeat Vor Aram, to defeat them, destroy them." And the Ton Hashem biyadem, and the 400 prophets were all chanting the same words. We're all saying the same thing, the chant: "Go up and succeed. God will give you success." Now we have the story, that piece of the story that's relevant to us. V'hamalach asher halach likro Michayahu, diber elav leimar, hinena divrei hanviyim pe'echad tov v'lamelech, hina dvarcha kidvar achad mehem v'dibarta tov. So the messenger who's bringing Michael to the king, he says, "Look, there are 400 prophets. They're all saying the same thing. You will succeed. Why don't you join with them? In other words, let's make it unanimous." Maybe some of you had that experience in your lives. You're in a group of people and they take a vote. And it's 4-2, it's whatever. And you're one of the two. And they say to you, "Change your vote. Let's make it unanimous. Let's make it unanimous. 6-0. We don't want a 4-2 vote. 4-2 will win. We have a majority, but let's make it unanimous." So that's what this messenger says to Michael ben Yimla. Says, "Listen, they're all saying, go up and attack, go up and attack. God will give you a victory. So why don't you join with them? Say the same thing. Let's make it unanimous." Says Michael, "Chai Hashem, I swear. Ki et asher yamar Hashem elai oto adaber." Says, "Look, I'm a prophet. I have to say what God tells me to say. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say what God tells me to say." Fine. Vayavo el hamelech, vayomer hamelech elav, Michael, hanelech el Ramot Gilad lamilchama imechtal. Same question. Michael, shall I go up to Ramot Gilad or not? What should I do? Vayomer elav alei v'hatzlach, v'natan Hashem b'yad hamelech. And Michael ben Yimla says exactly the language of the 400 prophets. Go up and succeed, and God will give you Ramot Gilad. Vayomer elav hamelech, And the king says to Michael ben Yimla, Ad kama pamim ani mashpiyecha, ashelo tudaber elai rak emet b'shem Hashem. So the king, Achav says, he isn't repeating the words of the other prophets. He says, no, he says, I told you, I'm imposing upon you an oath. I want you to tell me what God actually said. Because Michael was saying exactly what the 400 prophets are saying. So Michael answers him, Vayomer, Ra'iti et kol Yisrael nifotzim el he'orim, katzona she'en lehem roeh. Vayomer Hashem lo adonim la'ela, yashuvu ish l'reito b'shalom. You want to know what I actually saw? I saw Israel scattered amongst the hills. And God said, they have no leader. Their leader is gone. Let them go back to their homes in peace. In other words, what is he saying to Achav? In this war, their leader, who's the king of Israel, is going to be killed. It's going to disappear. That's what God told me. So Achav turns to the ocean and says, I told you he has nothing good to say about me. Right. Now, before we get to the explanation, the story is so, the reason I like this story so much is it's so real. I have this in my life all the time. People ask me questions all the time because, when they ask me a question, I'm going to try to tell them what I actually think. And people want, tell me the truth. All these people are talking. What do you really think? And I want to hear the truth. So I tell them what I really think. And most of the times they actually resent it. They don't like it. They don't want to hear the truth, really. They like it and they don't like it. And here you have an interesting thing about Achav. This is not our book that we're studying. But Achav is very interesting. Because on one hand, he resents what the guy says. On the other hand, when the guy said to him, go and succeed, he says, no, tell me the truth. I really want to hear the truth. And when he tells him the truth, he says, I told you, there's nothing good to say about me. But we, the reader, have a different question. We have a different question, relevant to Mishpatim, chapter 23, which is a very simple question. Why did Michael ben Yimla initially lie? Why did he follow the majority, right? We're looking at this story because this is exactly a case. The Torah says, do not follow the majority to do evil, to speak evil. There are 400 false prophets. They're all saying exactly the same thing, which is evidence that they're false because two prophets don't speak the same language. Here they're all chanting together. They're false prophets, probably Baal prophets. But Michael, when he's first brought to the king, he says the same thing. And Achav says, no, tell me what you really think. What I really think, what's really true? Okay, he tells him. Yaakov, of course, resents that. So Michael ben Yimla is going to explain, actually. He's going to explain why he did this. And he says the following. L'chein shema dvar Hashem. Listen to what God said. Ra'iti et Hashem yoshev al kiso. V'chol tzva shamayim omed olav mimino u'mismalo. What I saw was God is sitting on God's throne, and the heavenly host is standing around God. This is what I saw in my vision. Vayomer Hashem, mi yifateh et achav v'yal v'yipol b'ramot Gilad. God said, who will mislead Achav so that he goes and fights in Ramot Gilad and gets killed? Who's going to help me mislead this guy? So the heavenly host is there. Each one has some advice. Oh, I can do it, or I can do it, or I can do it. And finally, the Ruach, the Spirit. The Spirit said before God, I will mislead him. Vayomer Hashem elav b'ma. Vayomer eitzei voyiti ruach sheker. I will be a spirit, a false spirit, in the mouths of his prophets. Vayomer, and God said to the Spirit, Tifakeh v'gam tuchal. Say, good idea. Go and mislead the prophets. V'yatoh hinei natan Hashem ruach sheker b'fi kol neviecha eleh Hashem diber alecha ra'ah. So that's Michayahu explains. Here's what I really saw. But the explanation of Michayahu, that God was sitting on God's throne, it's interesting because you have the below in the threshing place, you have Yoshaphat and Achim sitting on their thrones. And God's on God's throne, surrounded by God's host. And they're surrounded by the prophets. And Michael says, no. He says, these prophets are sent by God to mislead you. So actually what Michael is saying, in my opinion, is, and that's why I said what I said. Why did I lie? Not because I go with the majority who lie. No, I'm a prophet. I have to speak the truth. But in this case, the truth is a lie, because the whole point is to mislead you. So initially, I'm part of the group that's actually misleading you, because that's my task. My task is to be a false prophecy that will entice you to go north and to get killed. But since you asked me, since you don't accept my prophecy, what I really think, I'll tell you what I really think, and he explains it. But what do I cite the story? I happen to love the story over here, because it's so real and so true. But this exactly is, in my view, exactly what the Torah says. Don't follow the majority. All the prophets are saying one thing. Isn't there another prophet? Yes, this other guy. He never says anything. Bring the other guy. Let's see what he has to say. At the end of the day, he says he has a different opinion. He explains himself. His opinion is, no. 400 prophets, they're all saying the same thing. I'm not going along with them. What, you want to know the truth? I'll tell you the truth. That's not a case of a case of judgment in the narrow sense of judgment. That's a case of giving advice, actually. But we can well imagine, back to our verse now, do not follow the majority of the ra'ot. We could imagine that, not a prophet and not a king and not a judge, but in our everyday lives, we make all kinds of decisions. We're confronted with decisions, sometimes personal decisions, work or whatever it is, and the majority thinks a certain way, and the expectation is that the individual will go along with the majority. And the Torah says, don't do that. If you think it's wrong, don't follow the majority. So that's referring to an individual person. The Gemara, however, and this is what's very interesting. Maybe we'll do this more in length next week. But the Gemara understands this verse to refer to the court. And here we come to one of the interesting questions when we study Mishpatim. We came across this with the Shomrim, and that is when you read these verses and you want to understand what is the Pshut of Shemekra, what does the Torah seem to be actually the best plausible reading of the text, and then you come to the rabbinic understanding of these texts, which very often is quite different from, and sometimes seems to deviate greatly from the plain meaning of the text. The Gemara, in many places in the Talmud, has an idea which is central to Talmudic law, not just Talmudic law, to Talmudic thinking in general. And that is, they have a concept called rov. You follow the majority. That is true, for example, in court decisions. If you have three judges, case comes before three judges, you follow the majority. If two say Reuven wins and one says Shimon wins, we follow the majority, we follow the courts, follow the rov. That's a central feature of law and the way decisions are rendered in the court. That's true in the case of court of three. It's also true in the case of court of 23, with one slight difference that I'll come to in a moment. But that's the basic idea. And the idea of following the majority is not limited to the court. It applies in many other situations as well. For example, we have a principle of following the majority when it comes to whether you could eat. You find a case in the Gemara, you're walking in the street, you see 10 pieces of meat in the street. 9 of them are kosher. And one is certainly not kosher, but you don't know which one. It doesn't have to be 10 pieces, it can be 3 pieces of meat. You have 3 pieces of meat in the street. You know, one of them is not kosher. Two are kosher. Are you allowed to take a piece of meat and to eat this piece of meat? Because the chances are 2 out of 3 that the meat is actually kosher. The halacha is you are allowed to eat it. You're actually allowed to follow the majority. Not only that, according to almost everybody, not only can you eat one piece of meat, you can eat 2 of them. Because if you ate the first one, you come down to 2 pieces left, you say, well, there are 2 pieces left. One is certainly kosher. The other one, I don't know. Is it not kosher? Or maybe the one I ate first was not kosher. But these 2 are kosher. And you are actually allowed to eat a second piece of meat. It's a remarkable rule. According to some, you can even eat 3 pieces of meat fundamentally, but that's a separate question. My point is, the idea of following the majority is so basic. I'll give you another example of it. Another example where the Gemara discusses following the majority. In a case, for example, in the Chumash, in the book of Devarim, there's the case of the Egla Arufa. That is to say, a body is found, somebody was murdered, and you don't know who did it. And the body is found between 2 cities. The Torah says that you measure to the closest city. And the elders from that city come out, and some priests come out, and members of the court, and there's a whole procedure called the Egla Arufa. The kind of atoning for the fact that somebody was killed. We don't know who it is, and you measure to the closest city. So we assume that maybe the murderer is in the closest city, or maybe the victim was in the closest city, it wasn't protected properly. So you measure to the closest city. That's what the Torah says. Probably familiar to all of us. The Gemara, though, raises the following question. What about there are 2 cities that are pretty close? One's a little closer. But one city has a much bigger population than the other. So the chances are one city is a city of 10,000 people. One's a city of 1,000 people. The 1,000 is a little closer, but the 10,000 is bigger. Which city do we go to for the atonement ceremony? To the one that's closer. This is what the Torah says, you go to the closest city. Or do you go to the city which is more populous? Rov v'karov. Gemara in Bava Batra, Rov v'karov. And the Gemara says, you follow the Rov. Even though the Torah said you measure to the closest city, that's when the other cities are essentially the same size. But if one is Rov, if one has more people, then you follow the majority. So the idea of Rov is a fundamental core principle of Jewish law. Now, the fact of the matter is, first of all, let's take, for example, here in the United States, do we follow the majority, or do we need a unanimous decision? So it actually depends on the kind of case that it is. In many cases, you need the entire jury to actually agree. You need a unanimous decision. In some other cases, you don't need a unanimous decision. It varies from case to case. But in general, we think of a jury of a murder case or something. You need all the jury to actually agree. The halacha is not that way at all. In halacha, you follow the role, you follow the majority. And when the Gemara says you follow the majority, the Gemara says, of course you follow the majority. It says in the Torah, in chapter 23 of Sefer Shemot, in our chapter, Mishpatim, Acharei Rabim Lahatot. Follow the majority. So it's the Gemara says that you follow the majority. It says in the Pasuk. When you open up the Chumash and read the Pasuk, does it actually say that at all? It certainly doesn't say that, and actually it may even say the opposite. As don't follow the majority. How is the Gemara in Sanhedrin read this Pasuk? It reads it the following way. The case is talking about, says the Gemara, a case of someone's accused of murder. Cases of murder, it's a capital offense. You need the court of you need 23. So the Gemara's understanding of the verse, which is not the plain meaning of the verse, do not follow the majority. In other words, you follow the majority. When do you follow the majority? When do you not follow the majority? to vindicate the accused murderer, you follow the majority. If 12 say innocent and 11 say guilty, the person goes free. You follow the majority. But if 12 say guilty and 11 say innocent, you don't follow the majority. You need a majority of 2 to convict, and a majority of 1 to exonerate. And that's how they read the pasuk. But the fact of the matter is, that when you read the verse, you can read the verse exactly the opposite way. In other words, let's say it refers to judges. Lo tiyeh acharei rabim liraot. In other words, the 22 judges will say guilty. And they turn to you and you say, I think the guy's innocent. But you know what? Says the Torah, don't go along with the other 22. Don't go along with the 22 to make it unanimous and convict. Don't follow the majority. If you believe the guy's innocent, do not follow the majority, l'ra'ot, to do what is wrong in your eyes or to harm the person. So the fact of the matter is, you can read the verse very simply as the Torah doesn't know from following majorities. What's interesting then is that following a majority, a rove, is not just about judges in the Talmud. It is one of the most fundamental and basic principles of Talmudic law. And as I mentioned, I give you other examples where we have the idea of rove. So what's interesting is, maybe come back to this more next week, but the interesting question is to what extent the rabbinic law is rooted in what we call pshuto shel mikra, and to what extent the rabbinic law is going off in different directions. It tries to connect itself to the verse, or maybe rereads or reinterprets the verses, but in the plain reading of the verse, there seems to be no basis for it whatsoever. And I chose this as an example just because it's something that is so central to rabbinic thinking. Part of it is probably the idea of following the majority and not requiring a kind of unanimity. Probably what lies behind it is the sense that, do we really ever know for sure? In other words, if you're going to if the system demands that you know 100%, you can't have a system of law because you never know 100%. We enter into the area of law knowing that mistakes are possible. On the other hand, if you want perfection, you have no law at all. So we're forced to make a choice over here. Do we do what is highly plausible or very reasonable, with an understanding that we could be wrong? The idea of rove is you follow the majority, but you understand that you're not necessarily correct. But we have no other choice but to follow the majority, as opposed to it has to be unanimous, which would suggest that actually you can know something 100%. And I would say sometimes we can know something almost certainly, but in the great majority of the cases, that's not true. But I cited this verse because acharei rabim lahatot, maybe deal with this more next week, is cited all the time. Of course you follow the rove, acharei rabim lahatot, but is that what the verse actually means? So maybe next week we'll go more deeply into it. I cited it as an example. In any event, what we have over here is a set of laws. And what I wanted to look at this morning are 2 verses in chapter 23, verses number 4 and verses number 5, and compare and contrast to what we find in a quite parallel section in the book of Devarim. But before we do that, let me just stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions or suggestions.
I have a question. Regarding as this relates to the week's parsha, so if the 12 spies, the 12 scouts go to the land, and 10 say lo na'aleh, and Yehoshua and Caleb say la'alot, we can do it, God will be with us. So it seems as if your class today is made for the parsha. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? It's clearly, I mean, the lesson is so clear, it's written on our foreheads. It's not a harei rabim lahatot, absolutely not. It's a case of what you would call, to read it, b'pshushot pshuto shel mikra lo tihiyeh acharei rabim l'ra'ot.
Right.
So
That's
could
an
you
excellent
speak about
point,
that?
actually. That's an excellent point. The whole point of the parsha is exactly this verse: do not follow the majority to do evil. So Kalev and then Yoshua also speaks up, and they say, no, this is not right. You can't always follow the majority. In other words, you have to take other factors into consideration. One is just the setting, just as the whole history of it. That's clearly from the Torah standpoint, it's not a democracy in that sense. I mean, Moshe doesn't have just one vote, and Yoshua and Kalev don't have just one vote. You have to look at the larger context. But the point is that the whole point of Kalev, when God says, Kalev, my servant, he had a different way about him. And actually, the end of the parsha also, which Parsha Tzitzit, Lo tatur acharei levavchem ve'acharei neichem. So there, I would say it's not a court of law, but I think that speaks exactly to this verse, which is, don't just see the statistics, 60% think this way or 80%, I'm going to go with it. No, you have to think for yourself. You have to try to figure out what's right or wrong. And what's right or wrong is not just a function of numbers. What's right or wrong is a function of, who is doing the teaching, who is the kind of history that we have, etc. Where is this truth coming from or non-truth coming from? What are the sources, etc. We're not always equipped to make these decisions. In many things in life, we don't have enough information. But in the case of Kalev, in the case of Yoshua and Moshe and all that, the Chumash says they have information and they stuck to their guns. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the 10 tribes are simply afraid. The 10 scouts, they're afraid to go. That's what it comes down to. So they're just afraid. And Yoshua's coach says we can't be afraid. But your point is very well taken. And it's actually more to say about that. Maybe in the future we'll talk some more about that whole story of the Meraglim, because there you have exactly this case where the majority say X, and it's clear that the Torah's view is not X. That's for sure. So that's an excellent point.
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
talk about not going with majority and stepping outside the usual Perush. Rabbi Schneerson had said that those 10 Meraglim were not afraid of failing, afraid of succeeding and getting away from the close relationship of Hashem and working and having to do the land, etc. So that was pretty radical too. That was radical too.
Right, you have that in the Ksiv, for example. The question is what the scouts were about and why they prefer to stay in the desert. You have God's direct connection, as opposed to the land where you have to set up your own society, and God is more distant. So that thought does appear in some thinkers, but in any event, that's another question as to what the thinking of the 10 is. That's a good question. And it's a broader question because there's the question of the 10, and the other question is to whom do the people listen? That's really in Sefer Dvarim. That's the question. The people are given two different stories, and how do you decide which one to choose? Do you just say I'll follow the majority, or do you say let's understand what each one is saying, where they're coming from, etc.? And I think that in Sefer Dvarim, that's the way Moshe presents it there. Yes, the majority said X, but the other ones were talking in a way that was consonant with God's commands and with God's values. And then you have to follow that and not just follow the majority. All right, what I wanted to get to, at least to start this now, are two verses in chapter 23. And the two verses are this. It starts with, don't follow the majority to do evil. It talks about testimony. We'll maybe get more back to this next week. That's chapter 23, verses 1, 2, and 3. And then when you get to verse 6, 7, 8, it also talks about law, right? It talks about not to subvert justice, do not keep away from falsehood, right? Don't bring death upon the innocent, etc. Sounds like they're talking to the court. Maybe not only the court, but the court. So maybe come back to this next week. But in between, as we've seen this very often, this ABA structure. In between the first three verses and the three verses that follow, we have two verses, verses 4 and verses number 5. Let's take a look at verses 4 and 5. Ki tifgash o yivcha o chamaro toeh, hashev teshivenu lo. Ki tirech hamor somnacha, rovetz tachat masao v'chodata me'azov lo, Azov ta'azov imo. So when you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering means it's lost, it's toed, it's lost. You see an animal wandering around, the animal belongs to oyivcha, to your enemy. An oyev is an enemy. You shall bring it back to him. You see the animal wandering around, you know who the owner is, it's an enemy. You have to return the animal to the owner. That's verse number 4. Verse number 5, ki terech hamor sonacha. Or if you see the ass of, again, your enemy, sonacha, one who hates you. Roveitz tachat masao, struggling under its burden. The animal has a lot of packages on its back, and it's struggling, it's crouching down. You would refrain from azov. The question of what azov means. But for our purpose, let's say it means to help, to assist. It's an interesting word, azov. It usually means to abandon. Sometimes it means something else. Here it doesn't mean to abandon. Azov to azov imo, you shall surely, here they translate, raise it. The Gemara understands not raising. The Gemara understands that the mitzvah is to unpack it. What the Gemara calls prika, to unpack. The animal is struggling. There's too much on its back. It's in pain. So you have to help unload the animal. Azov to azov imo. These are the two verses over here. Okay. Now what's interesting, more than just interesting, is we have parallel verses in the book of Devarim. Parallel verses and expanded verses in the book of Devarim. And this is in Devarim chapter 22. Chapter 22 in Sefer Devarim, the very beginning, of chapter 22. Right, everybody see that? It says, Lo tireh. Yeah, right there on the screen, you have it. Lo tireh et shor achicha, o et sayom nidachim, v'talam tamehem. Hashev teshivem liachicha. V'yimlo karove achicha elecha v'lo yidato, v'asafto otot betecha. V'aya imcha adrosh achicha oto, v'ashev oto lo. V'chein taseh lechamoro, v'chein taseh lesimrato, v'chein taseh lechol avedat achicha. Asher tovad mimenu umtzata, lo tuchal lehitalem. In the next verse, Lo tireh et chamor achicha osharo noflim baderech v'talamta mehem hakem takim imo. Let me read the English over here. The parallel and the differences between the verses in Devarim and the verses in Mishpatim, in Shemot, are very striking. Let's read this first. I'm not sure we have enough time to do all this today. Maybe we'll continue with it next week. If you see your fellow's ox, achicha, literally your brother's ox, or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your brother. The word is achicha, they translate fellow. If your brother does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home. It shall remain with you until your brother claims it. Then you will give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass, the same with his garment. So too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. Lo tuchal lehitalem. And the last verse, if you see your fellow's ass or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. You must help him raise it. So we have here two different, again, the parallels are very striking. And the differences are also very striking. So what is this about over here? So the one in Devarim, which is much longer than the section in Mishpatim, these verses, verse 1 through verse number 4, this comes, generally speaking, there are two mitzvot over here. One mitzvah, generally speaking, is what we call hashavat avedah, to return a lost object. Hashavat avedah. The verse number 3, v'chein taseh l'chol avedat achicha. The Torah calls it an Avedah. An Avedah is something that is lost. Now here, the Torah expands this. What is striking is that a word that appears 3 times in chapter 22 of Sefer Dvarim, which is very striking. The Torah says, if you see, for example, in the first verse, the ox of your brother or his sheep gone astray, v'hit alamta mehem, you might choose to v'hit alamta, to ignore it or to pretend you don't see it. The Torah says, don't do that. Don't do that. Pick it up. And if you don't know who lost it, hold on to it until the one who lost it claims it. That's what it says here in the Chumash. And the Torah adds, the same is not just for his animal, but anything that he lost, a garment, for example, anything that's lost. Lo tuchal lehit alein, you may not be indifferent. You may not pretend you didn't see it. You have actually the obligation to pick it up. And then the next verse is if you see the animal of your brother fallen down, he fell down, do not be indifferent. Hitalamta, hakem takim, raise the animal up. Now, that's what it says in Sefer Dvarim. Let's get back to our section over here in Mishpatim. What is this mitzvah over here in chapter 23, verses 4 and 5? So let's go back to our verses. Chapter 23, verse number 4. Ki tifga shoy o yivcha o chamaro to'eh, hashev teshivenu ro. You see an animal wandering about. It seems that it's lost, right? You shall return, hashev teshivenu ro. You shall return the animal to its owner. It sounds like the mitzvah of hashavat avedah, to return a lost object, which is the subject of the many verses in Sefer Devarim that we just saw. The next verse also has a parallel in Sefer Devarim, the animal that is struggling under its burden. In verse number 5, Chamor sonacha rovetz tachat masa'o, chadalta me'azovro, and you might, says the Torah, you might consider not to help. Right? You say, why should I help this guy? This is my enemy. Why should I help? Says the Torah, don't do that. Azov ta'azov imo. What's interesting is here the Torah doesn't use the verb hitalein. It just says you might refrain from helping. You should help. The rabbinic understanding, which could be the plain meaning over here, is you should help unload the animal, what they call prika. In Sefer Devarim, where the animal has fallen down, and it said hakem takim imo, is what the Gemara calls te'ina, to put the animal back on its feet, and if the animal has packages, to put the packages back on, or if there's a rider, the rider can then continue the journey. So there are 2 different mitzvot over here. One seems to be to return a lost object, hashavat avedah, and the other has to do with the animal, either helping the animal unload the packages, or helping or putting the packages back on. What's called prika and then te'ina, and those 2 mitzvot of hashavat avedah and prika and te'ina are the subject of the 2nd chapter of Bava Metzia, the parak called Elu Metziot. In many places that learn in Gemara, that's the first Gemara that they teach, actually. It's interesting. And they come together in the Mishnah. Now the question is, what actually is the difference between the 2 parashiyot? There are many differences. And what is the subject actually of our parasha? Ki tifga shor o yivcha, ki terech hamor sonacha. I wanted to focus on our chapter over here, of course, in light of Sefer Dvarim, and really ask the question, what is the Torah speaking about over here? The first thing we notice is that in verses 4 and 5, the owner is called Oyivcha or Sonacha. Oyev is an enemy. Sonei is one who hates you. And it's not clear when you read the Chumash, who is this Oyev or Sonei? In other words, is this a Jew or a non-Jew? So the Gemara takes it, actually, that it refers to a Jew. And the truth of the matter is, it's hard to know, but I would say the following. A Sonei can be a Jew, that's for sure. But to say an Oyev typically is a foreign enemy, not your fellow Jew. That's an interesting question. Does this rule apply to a non-Jew or only to a Jew? What's striking about that is when you look at Sefer Devarim, there the Torah had a different word. There the Torah doesn't speak about a sonei or an oyev. But in Sefer Devarim, the word that is repeated multiple times is the word achicha, your brother. Now, of course, it doesn't mean your actual biological brother necessarily. But it doesn't mean anybody. It means one of your kinsmen. And the word achicha is repeated there. Lo tireh et shar achicha, o etzion nidachim, etc. Hashev teshivim li achicha, v'lo karov achicha v'lo yedato. You have 3 times in the very beginning, adirosh achicha, a 4th time. And again in the next verse, chol avedato achicha, a 5th time. And again, lo tireh chamar achicha. Right? You have 6 times in these 4 verses, we have the word achicha. In contrast to what we have over here, which talks about sonacha and oyivcha. That's one thing that strikes us immediately. The second thing that strikes us is that in Sefer Devarim, 3 times you have the word hit aleim, to act with indifference, or maybe to pretend you don't actually see it. That doesn't appear here at all, not at all. The third difference, which I wanted to begin with, is the following. That over here in Parshat Mishpatim, it talks about animals, right? Shor oyivcha ochamoro in verse number 4, and in verse number 5, chamor sonacha rovetz tachat masao, right? The shore typically, gets ochamoro, they can get lost. But in terms of the animal struggling under its burden, the Gemara assumes that chamor, it's more likely that the chamor is a beast of burden more than the shor. In any event, but it doesn't talk about what about if you find somebody's pencil case? What about if you find someone's garment? That's not mentioned over here. But in Sefer Devarim, it says, "V'chein ta'aseh lechamoro," in verse number 3. "V'chein ta'aseh l'simrato, v'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedat ochicha shetovad mimenu umsata." There you have the word aveda, first of all, hashavat aveda. The word aveda appears in Devarim, does not appear over here. And secondly, in Sefer Devarim, it's not limited to an animal. Not at all. It says, kol avedat ochicha, anything, in fact. And it even singles out simlato, a garment. So what do we make of the difference between the description, the mitzvah in Sefer Devarim on one hand, and the mitzvah as described in our parsha in Mishpatim? I mean, in general, and what makes Sefer Devarim so interesting is that Sefer Devarim is different in every respect. Apart from all the contradictions, of which the book is replete with contradictions, it's a completely different kind of book. Different language, different rules, often contradictory rules. And that's really a fascinating study. Sefer Devarim is really a fascinating study. I'm thinking about teaching it soon because it's something which is so incredibly interesting. But let's get back to our 2 verses over here. And there are 2 ways to read these 2 verses, I think. One way is to say the following. It's not actually talking about returning lost objects. That's not the subject over here. Returning lost objects is the study of the verses in Sefer Devarim. called Avedat Achicha. But over here, it's not about lost objects at all. It's about something else. It's about the suffering animal. In verse number 4, you have an animal that's lost. The animal is to'eh. So we have a responsibility to the animal to return the animal to its rightful owner, to bring the animal back home. That's in verse number 4. In verse number 5, you have the animal which is suffering in great pain because it's overloaded and it's collapsing under the burden. And then the Torah says you have the responsibility to take the burden off the animal, to relieve the animal of its pain, which it is suffering because it is overloaded with various merchandise or whatever. It's what the Gemara calls Sar Ba'alei Chayim. Now it's interesting that Sar Ba'alei Chayim, already in the Talmud, is a dispute whether such a concept exists. In other words, is it forbidden to cause pain to an animal? That is to say, needless pain. The Torah doesn't outlaw shechita, that kind of thing. You're allowed to use the animals to work for you. But can you subject the animal to an inordinate amount of pain? Or even beyond that, you have to ensure that the animal is not suffering. In this case over here, it's not something that you are imposing on the animal. You didn't load the animal up. Someone else did. Someone you don't even like, actually. Someone who's your enemy. And what the Torah could be saying is, okay, that person is your enemy. But this animal is not your enemy. This animal has nothing to do with it. Animal has nothing to do with anything. You don't like the other guy, you hate him, whatever, but the animal still is suffering, and you have the responsibility to take care of the animal. And that would explain why it only talks about animals. It doesn't talk about returning lost objects to the owner, because maybe you have no responsibility to return the lost object to your enemy, to the one that hates you. Sonacha or yivcha. That's not the subject over here. The subject over here is suffering of the animal. That is one way to read it. Okay, that's one way to read it. The other way to read it is to say no, that actually, at least verse number 4, Ki tifgasho or yivcha o chamorot to'eh hashev teshivenu lo, that you have the responsibility to return a lost object. This animal is to'eh, it's a lost object, and you have a responsibility to return the animal. And it talks about your enemy. You have to assume it means even your enemy. You don't like the guy, or he's a nasty person, a bad guy. Okay, but nonetheless, the Gemara assumes that for the most part, the Mechilta, it's a question actually, is the enemy a Jew or a non-Jew? Let's assume it's a Jew. A Jew that hates you, you hate him. But you have still responsibility of Hashev Teshivenu Lo Hashavat Avedah. Torah didn't use the word Avedah, but in fact, that's what we're talking about. That's what you have over here, these two verses. But when you come to Sefer Dvarim, what's interesting is chapter 22 of Sefer Dvarim, you have a much expanded obligation over there. And first of all, the Torah limits it over there, seems to limit it to your brother, to achicha, to achicha. That's the 6 times you have the word achicha. And what it sounds like actually is that in Sefer Devarim, it's making a different point actually, which is a very interesting point, and that is, and which fits in with Sefer Devarim generally, I would add, which is that in our parsha, the concern is the following: someone's going to lose. Someone has an animal which is lost. Animals can be expensive things, so I have the obligation to make sure that this person doesn't suffer a great loss, doesn't suffer a loss. And that's the subject. An animal is a valuable piece of property. It's lost, worth $10,000 or whatever it's worth, and I know who the owner is, someone I dislike actually, but I should help this person in the sense that prevent the person from suffering a monetary loss. It's not nothing personal, but I have an obligation that people shouldn't. I have an obligation to prevent somebody from suffering a monetary loss. But when Sefer Dvarim talks about this, it puts it in very different terms. The person we're talking about is Achicha. And when it comes to Achicha, there you have a different level of obligation. There the obligation is to actually care for your brother, which is why the Torah emphasizes 3 different times, V'talamta mehem. In other words, you could simply just pass by. You could just say, listen, it's not my problem. V'talamta mehem. And question, V'talamta means I purposely don't see it, or V'talamta means I go about my normal path. I'm not looking out for it. And maybe what the Torah is saying is that you can't do that. And in Sefer Devarim, lo tuchal lehitalem, you have to proactively try to assist the other person. Because the other person, in this case, is your brother, in the broader sense of brother, whatever brother encompasses. Doesn't mean your biological brother, but it means your kinsman. And not only that, but in Sefer Devarim, which goes way beyond anything that we have in our parsha, in Mishpatim, here you have this idea of actually caring for the object. In other words, in Sefer, in our parsha, in Mishpatim, you know who the other person is. You know him well because you hate his guts. You know exactly who he is. So you're going to take this animal and bring it back. But in Sefer Devarim, you don't know who the owner is. You presume it to be a neighbor or one of your kinsmen, but you don't know for sure. So what do you do in that case? You don't know who it is. Then says the Torah, remarkable rule, you have to take the animal to your house and you wait. You keep it in your possession until the owner makes the request. That's what it says. Now the Torah doesn't deal with the question of how long do you have to wait? Does this go on forever? Furthermore, how do you know the person who's demanding it actually belongs to him? How do you know? These are all questions that the Gemara deals with. It's interesting questions. Under what conditions can you keep it? That's the Gemara's question. But in the Chumash, in any event, doesn't deal with this, at least not explicitly. And this applies to any possession. Kol avidat achicha, something asher tovad mimeno, something that's lost to your brother. It's not just about the monetary side of it. It goes way beyond that. And what's interesting is, in thinking about these verses in Sefer Devarim, one of the unique features of Sefer Devarim is that Sefer Devarim deals more than any other book with kind of internal states. So in Sefer Devarim, you have the idea in spades of the phrase "B'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha." We have this idea of serving God with all your heart and all your soul. The idea of an internal state, the idea of simcha, that the internal state, it's not just what you do, but it's the internal state. And we hear
Rabbi
3
Silber?
times kinds of awareness. Yes.
Well, you could almost think it's not like this because it's not linear, but it's a 5th book. So you're hoping for more of a developed ethical decision, moral decision making. I mean, like Kohlberg, it's not the case. But being that it's the 5th book, that's what Devarim refers to. I don't know, some level.
Yeah, it's the 5th book, but it's also a book which is, I mean, it starts by saying we are reviewing the other books. It's called Mishnah Torah. But it is different in every way. There's not a single story in Sefer Devarim which is simply a repeat. and you raise an important question about Sefer Devarim in general, which is why it's so interesting. Apart from all the contradictions, it's not just contradictions of fact, it's also a whole different way of presenting the person and service of God. Whether it's simcha, whether it's description of repentance as a lengthy process, and over here it's a kind of awareness. Now this awareness is limited to your kinsman. In other words, it goes beyond. I want to say one thing about Hashavat Aveda. Maybe I'll just stop with this point about Hashavat Aveda. Hashavat Aveda, actually, when you think about it, is not obvious. In other words, someone lost something. I find it. You could easily make the argument, if somebody lost something, then it's out of their purview. Probably most people anticipate they'll never get it back. So just keep it. Finders keepers, losers weepers. Let's reduce it to that, you know. The Torah says no. The Torah says that you actually have to pick it up. You can't be oblivious to this. And not only that, but remarkably, you have to care for the object. You're caring for someone else's object. You don't know who the person is. That person doesn't know you, who you are. And you actually have to guard and protect this object. And the Talmud goes beyond this and says you have the actual obligation of somebody who was hired to watch, hired to guard, Shomer Sachar. So it's actually a rather remarkable rule, if you think about this, Hashavat Aveda. And it speaks to, I think, this idea in Sefer Devarim of the care we have to show to the other person. It's not just about a monetary loss over here. There's a kind of personal connection. Maybe we could talk a bit more about that next week. And I wanted to come back next week also to what we started before about these verses in chapter 23 that come before the two verses that we looked at now and those that follow. Some of these rules about to whom is the Torah speaking in Parshat Mishpatim, to the individual person or to the court or to the court system. That's something that we'll look at next week in the last of these three sessions. Looking forward to it as well. If there are any comments or questions now, we have a minute or two. And otherwise, we will continue next week with the last of these three additional sessions.
And I'd like to remind people about some upcoming classes as people think of any last thoughts. Starting this week on Monday at 1 p.m. and also at Tuesday 1 p.m. we're opening some of our afternoon summer kolo classes to the general public, including with Rabbi Silber and with Rabbi John Kelson. You can find out more at drisha.org/classes. We will be starting a new Masechet in Mishnah in depth soon. We will begin Horiot on July 6th. And if you have any questions, you can, after class, you can always reach out to us at Drisha, inquiry@drisha.org or dsilber@drisha.org. And with that, take care and be well.